going to snudge this up a little bit. Any better? Fabulous. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. This is a full house. Incredible. Thank you all so much for coming out. A quick 2 minutes just overview of the space and also live stream setup as well. You are currently here in the museum. If you need a restroom or the water fountain, it's going to be across the gallery and to the left in the Arts and Music Department. If you need an exit, the stairwell and the elevator are out into the gallery and to the right, same way you came up probably to get here. We are live streaming this event. Hello, live stream friends at home. The camera is focused primarily on this space, but those of you in the front row, you might have a touch of the back of your heads on here. I say this also to say, if you have a question during Q&A that you would like to ask, our friends at home can only hear things that are spoken into a microphone. So when you have a question, please raise your hand. I will come bring this over to you, and that way everyone can hear. And the live stream will also be posted on our YouTube channel as a recording sometime tomorrow, so you can come back and watch it later, share it with your friends and family. And for those of you who cannot make it in person, you can rewatch as well. My name is Priya. I'm the head of adult services here at Forbes, and I will be sat in the very back of the room. So for those of you who are here today, if you have any questions or want to talk more about our programming or collections or just say hi, please come find me at the end of the program. There are books for sale from Broadside Bookshop out front. You probably walked right past them or purchased your copy on the way in, which is amazing. Please stop and see Roz at the end of the program as well. There will be time for purchasing at that point. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Professor Michael Gorra to do the introduction for our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear? Should I hold? I'll hold this thing. Tony thought that nobody was going to come tonight. But good evening, and thank you for coming to celebrate Anthony Giardina's new novel, his complicated, risky, and wonderful new novel. It's called Remember This, and you will remember when you read it. You will remember. You have to remember this. Looking around the room, I see a lot of people I know, and a lot more whom I suspect Tony knows, and have known him for longer than I have, and I don't just mean Eileen. And I've known him for 30 years, so this isn't, I wonder, are old friends an easy crowd, a hard crowd? I can see it going both ways. But in any case, this is a hometown crowd. Oops, did I die? Did it die? There. Is going to be personal. Okay. I can use the handheld. That
can do just fine. Let's try. It's okay. Woo! Active.
Okay.
All right, come on there.
Okay, as I was saying, this is a hometown crowd, and so the introduction is going to be personal. I knew Tony's name a long time before I knew him, even before I'd come to teach at Smith, because I remember when his first novel came out, Men with Debts. I saw a review in Publishers Weekly. I saw it on the display table for new books at Wordsworth and Harvard Square. And something about the title drew me. It's a title that sums up a lot of the burden of Tony's work, his work over the years. He's always been interested in masculinity, in the nature of American manhood, though not at all in the way that it's talked about today. Because that masculinity for him is inseparable from the other word in that title, debts, obligations, responsibilities. It's an aspirational title. Those responsibilities are a burden, but they're also defining. There's something we should want. And then his next novel, A Boy's Pretensions. Now, that's a title that could have been chosen with the grad school Michael Gorra in mind. And at that point, I'll admit, I hadn't actually read his work. But I filed the name away and the dust jacket picture as well. So a few years later, I arrived at Northampton to teach at Smith. And I had an office in the basement of the Smith Library, which the library, as it then was, did have offices. Occasionally, I would come up for air. I'd come up into the furthest reaches of the third-floor periodical room, killing time, reading newspapers, escaping my own work. And I saw that there was a guy who was always there with paper and pen. Now, it was a good place to work. It's just the right amount of activity, never too crowded, never entirely empty. But this guy, so sometimes he's doodling, sometimes he's writing, and later I knew that doodling was in fact the way he began each writing day, by filling page after page with squibbles. Of course, it takes us a few years to say hello to each other, because this is New England. You know, the place where you can pass somebody on the street every day for years and never meet their eyes, lest you have to admit that you've been ignoring each other all this time. But eventually we started talking, and we haven't stopped since, and I expect that's true for a lot of you as well. We talk about books. We talk about food, what we're cooking, how much garlic. The aches and pains of aging. Movies. Anybody who's talked about movies with Tony knows that he has very odd taste. It's a fondness for actors nobody's ever heard of. We talk about mid-century, middle-brow culture. We talk about careers, how to sustain them. Stephen Sondheim, the Civil War, class in America, ethnic identity in America, family histories. I took his book of stories with me on vacation one year, a book called The Country of Marriage. And boy, I wish that the American literary marketplace allowed for more short stories, and especially for Tony to write more of them. And then I read Recent History, buying it actually after a Broadside reading. Now, that was maybe 4 novels ago, and one day in the Smith Library, he asked me what I thought. Well, that made me nervous. I told him I liked it, and I did like it, but he pressed. And so finally I did something that I'd never yet done with a book by a friend. I told him what I would have said if I were reviewing it. What worked, what didn't, what seemed some missed opportunities. I felt nervous as I spoke, because suppose this cost me a friendship. And in the years since, I have indeed stretched friendships and even damaged some of them by my answers to questions sort of like that. But at the end, he looked at me and he said, "You were going to keep all this good stuff to yourself?" And that says a lot about Tony, about his fundamental openness, his generosity, and even his lack of ego, or rather self-regard. He found something helpful in what I'd said, and he could put it to use in his next book, or so he thought. I mean, so he thought, because I don't know if anything I say is useful. And he wasn't ticked off, and that was the important thing. Now, Tony's done me the honor of asking me to read his last 2 novels in manuscript, to give them some notes, as they say in the theater. And especially with Remember This, I felt like I was in on it early. There was a lot of email, a certain amount of pandemic walking and talking along the Mill River, or out in the Leeds bike path. Once the pandemic had eased, a lot of rather loud talking in cafes downtown. What worked, what didn't, not quite, not yet. What was magnificent from the start, and what is even better now. What his agent said, his editor, the process of bringing the book to fruition. It's a novel that pulls everything he's ever written about together. Debts, pretensions, marriage, children, masculinity, class, and then many new things too. Above all, a spot-on account of the New York art world. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to read him, to know him, and to introduce him tonight to a crowd for which he really does need no introduction. Thank you.
I'm going to cry, if that's okay. The thing is, when you get old enough and you've done this enough, you can cry. Nobody's going to care. I want to thank you all for coming out on this appropriately bleak Ash Wednesday evening. This is the way it's supposed to be. Ash Wednesday is supposed to be the beginning of a very dark period. So I also want to thank you for coming out, because when they asked me, did I want to do this reading at the Broadside or here, I thought, oh God, what if I don't fill this room? It would be really embarrassing. So thank you for filling the room. I also want to start by saying something some of you know, not all of you know. I had a thing happen to me a few weeks ago where I had to have head surgery. I don't want to belabor it or talk too much about it. I just do want to say, because so many of you here, the extraordinary outpouring of help was so moving. And I'm not a sentimental guy, particularly about Northampton life, but I came away just feeling what a community we have. I mean, to just get phone calls when you're sitting in the hospital with 27 wires coming out of you, and emails, and people, Marty Wohl coming over and salting my driveway so that Eileen wouldn't fall. I couldn't go out. So I just want to say that. I have to say that. Thank you. Okay, so let's get to this book. I've been working on this book for over 6 years. I started it in 2018. And I had a feeling from the beginning that this was going to be my last book. Age, publishing, all of those things, one doesn't go on forever. And because I had that feeling that this was going to be my last book, there's this sense I want to put everything I've ever thought about into this book. I want to leave nothing out. So there were a number of worlds I wanted to kind of delve into. One was the world of the theater, which I've been laboring in New York on and off since the 70s. So Henry, the protagonist of this novel, is a playwright. His daughter Miranda is writing the biography of an artist who very much resembles Alice Neal. And my daughter, Nicola, introduced me to the work of Alice Neal. And in order to do that, I had to explore the world of mid-century American painting. And the wonderful thing about living here is I do most of my writing at the Smith Art Library anyway. That's where I go. I find myself a little desk, and I just write there. But surrounding me was the world of books about art. So every day I would study a painter, and I would just try to learn in order to master that as much as I could, the world of contemporary art. The other thing that I kept thinking about, and I guess I think about it more and more as I get older, is New York in the 1970s and the 1970s themselves. Eileen and I lived on the Upper West Side on 107th Street between West End and Riverside for about 10 years in the mid-70s to the mid-80s. And it's a part of my life I think about more and more because of what I think is so different now, not only about New York, but about the world we live in. And in the scene I'm going to read, you're going to perhaps notice how much probing that world has affected Miranda in her writing the biography of Alice Neal. The wonderful irony is that I only found out when I was researching Alice Neal that while we were living on 107th Street in the 70s, Alice Neal lived on the corner building. This big building, not a high-rise, but a big apartment building right on the corner of West End and Riverside. And West End and 107th. I probably ran into her several times a week, and damn that I didn't get to talk to her. But more than anything, when I was writing this novel, I wanted to explore fathers and daughters. It was a subject I felt I just had to deal with in a novel, and I don't think I really had before. A little bit, but not a lot. I have what I would characterize as a wonderful but complicated relationship with my daughter. Is that unusual? I bet if I asked the men in this room who have daughters who have uncomplicated relationships to raise their hands, very few hands would go up. Just guessing. I'm not going to do it. So the scene I'm going to write, I hope, explores a lot of the themes in the novel, so you'll have a sense of what goes on in it. I think the only things you need to know in order to understand this scene is that a woman named Lily is referenced. She's Miranda's mother, Henry's wife. It takes place in 2012 and 13, and Henry is rehearsing a play in New York. And there is a moment in the play when the song My Boy Bill is played on a record, on a turntable, sung by John Raitt, who was the original Billy Bigelow. You all know that, right? Like everybody knows. John Raitt, Bonnie's father, was the original Billy Bigelow, and the song, you all know the song, My Boy Bill will be tall and as tough as a tree. I have to sing at these readings. It's something I have to do. Okay, so let me just jump in. When rehearsals began in New York for Henry's play, he and Miranda found themselves in closer and more frequent contact. The theater had set Henry up in an apartment in a high-rise on West 48th Street, very close to where the play was rehearsing. Every morning, Henry would stop at the same coffee shop, order a latte to go, then stand outside the rehearsal hall smoking a single cigarette. Delicious. To be 72 and still doing this, to not have been sent off to the salt mines as so many of his contemporaries had. His first play had been produced on 42nd Street, the old Dust Bowl-like Far West 42nd Street in 1970. 1970. The headiness of those days came back to him as he smoked his cigarette, the memory of how alive it had all been, running into a very young Sam Shepard in bars in the village, a still largely unknown Al Pacino encountered in the street. My God, the cast of characters, the inevitable necrology that came with any serious recounting of those days. He sucked in on the cigarette, wishing to prolong it. I am 72 and still here. Henry's weeknights were mostly free, and occasionally lonely, he prevailed upon Miranda to join him at a midtown restaurant for dinner. She was faithful, not always free, but more often than not, willing to rearrange a previous plan in order to accommodate her father. He tried very hard to reach the chosen spot ahead of her, sensitive to the mild potential discomfort on her part of arriving there first. There were times, though, when he was delayed at rehearsal, and he would approach the restaurant to find Miranda alone at a table. Some parts of parenthood were apparently never outgrown. It had always broken his heart to have arrived late to pick her up at school when she'd been very young. Every day in rehearsal, when they played the John Raitt recording of My Boy Bill, he revisited his old protective feelings, always knowing that they were mixed with the selfish and cruel sides of parenthood. That urge to be rid of one's children sometimes, to be free of the endless and so often distressing consideration of them. How many Henrys walked through the door of the chosen restaurant, his face lit up with genuine gladness and with apology, to sit across from his daughter and place his hand over hers? Did she see or recognize more than one? Trouble at rehearsal again, he said, the second time this happened. She had already made headway toward consuming a glass of white wine. Was this evidence of a potential revival of the drinking problem she'd had in college? Stop. It's all right. I'm going to do girl voice, boy voice. I hope it works. I'm glad you could meet me, followed by a silence. Where to begin? Where to dip the cup into the seemingly stagnant, but in fact always fast-moving water of their long history? Miranda had made progress over the past 2 years. She had wrested permission from the two sons of Anna Soloff, had gotten hold of a cache of letters, had given names and contact information of those acquaintances of Anna still alive. Through a friend, she had secured an agent, and after a frustrating delay, the agent was finally negotiating a deal with a small publisher based on Miranda's proposal and first chapter. "Here's to your contract," Henry said, lifting an imaginary glass while looking around for their waiter. "Done on your own and done well, if I may say." Miranda said nothing, smiled at him as though she were scanning his words and his manner, seeing a great deal to react to in both, and choosing not to react, at least to say nothing. When he had his drink in hand, he made the toast formal. "And now tell me, though I'm not supposed to ask, how you're going to keep yourself alive until this magnum opus is finished." Choosing the words magnum opus was a mistake. He saw that quite clearly in her eyes. "I think you can probably remember similar moments in your life," she said. His face and the accompanying silence offered her an opening. "Times when you felt you had to do something that might not pay, and you worried how it might affect our well-being, mine and Mom's. More times than you can imagine. Well, understand, Miranda, that my life has resembled no one's so much as Mr. Magoo's. There is a Mr. Magoo cartoon, I can't remember which one, where, you remember he's basically blind? I remember. And he finds himself in a series of girders moving up in the sky at a construction site. Every time he's about to step off of one and fall into thin air, another one magically appears." She offered a hesitant smile. "When you suggest you're using my life as a model, I shudder. You're following in the path of a blind cartoon character as if he's Moses, which is probably as perfect a metaphor for the parent-child relationship as any I could come up with." She finished her wine. "Shall I order you another? Not if it's going to make you feel I have a drinking problem. I think no such thing. We should have ordered a bottle. One more will do me. Miranda." He reached out and touched her hand. She had grown, he had to take the time to acknowledge it, into a beautiful woman. Even the earliest sign of age, the slight reshaping of her face, did nothing to dispel the fact. At her birth, it had seemed distressingly like she might become a clone of her hangdog father. But as she'd grown, she'd moved steadily in the direction of her mother. Someone had told him once that baby girls resembled their fathers at birth in obedience to some ancient belief that this would make the father more likely to stick around. But there was never any chance that he would not. Both smitten and terrified from the moment she had breached her mother's womb, he had felt locked into an allegiance with this child. Not that this had made him what was conventionally called a good father. Quite the opposite at times. His appreciation of her beauty led inevitably to the issue of her uncoupled state. There had been great hope that the last of her serious young men, a saxophone player and erstwhile composer named Isaac, would be the one with whom Miranda might settle. A few years younger than Miranda, Isaac had the doughish, beautiful face of a yeshiva bocher. Did I pronounce that right? Bocher. Bocher. Thank you. With a goatee like a soft shaving brush. But there had never been between Isaac and Miranda a sense of destiny, such as the one he remembered feeling in his early years with Lily. Even allowing for Henry's dividedness and Lily's resistance to the idea of monogamy, it had been clear to both of them that each had discovered in the other an entirely necessary being. Was that no longer a part of the romantic apparatus for men and women of Miranda's generation, that sense of necessity? "Tell me about rehearsals," Miranda said, perhaps sensing where Henry's thoughts might be drifting. "Shall I be honest?" "No, lie." "Well, Waterston's loss was a blow. 2 months before rehearsals were to begin, Sam Waterston had had to drop out. A perfectly reasonable conflict, a TV project he had committed to, had to revise and delay its shooting schedule, which had left them scrambling for a new star, one they hadn't been able to find. Adam is very good, but he's not Sam Waterston, and I'm missing him, and frankly, beginning to worry. It'll be fine. Oh, God, Miranda, don't say that. That's the easiest thing in the world to say, it'll be fine. That's what we say to terminal patients, because what's the alternative? You're likely to die? She took no apparent offense, though he had been a little harsh. Sorry, I'm actually having a wonderful time. But rehearsals are always cozy and wonderful and jokey. And even when there are fights, you always feel like you're on the set of All About Eve, where everyone's a little larger than life, and it's not ultimately the most serious thing in the world. He gestured to the waiter to refill both their glasses. Except that ultimately, it is the most serious thing in the world. When you get in front of an audience, when you see the worried look of the producers, and they are worried, by the way, going up on Broadway without a star is a form of suicide. And then there's the verdict of the New York Times. Let's get drunk, shall we? Because talking about this is making me even more worried. It'll be fine. Shut up. They had achieved their comfortable place. Now tell me who you're dating. Now it's my turn to say shut up. The second glass of wine relaxed Henry dangerously. It always did. All right. I'm living like a nun, Miranda said, which is fine. I'm a writer now. He ran his finger along the rim of the wine glass to prolong something. What he was seeing in her was something strong, something to admire, and also something to be alarmed by. Were she another man's daughter, he could have relaxed and congratulate her. Her ultimate collapse, should there be one, would not be his responsibility. Well, welcome to the world of terminal uncertainty. It's not so bad. I make my rent. Yes, you've become a barista. She rode right over the slight disapproving tone. It hasn't been awful. 12 hours a week is all I need. I come home and I feel clean. Coming home from the auction house where I worked, I used to feel, God, just sort of dirty or soiled by the greed, the insanity. I mean, to have to act excited that some hedge fund guy paid a fortune for a Jeff Koons. He leaned forward slightly, hungry for something, her adult self on display, holding back from saying, but Miranda, you're 41. At a certain point, I may want to interview you. About what? About your life, about living on the Upper West Side in the 70s, what that was like. I'll tell you what it was like. It was scary, don't you remember? How many times did I have to run from muggers? She hesitated, smiled slightly, turning away from him, something clearly going on in her. Miranda, what is it? Shall we order? Maybe the wine is making us both a little morose. No. I feel like I carried something out of that time. You know this, our time on 107th Street. Something that's never left me. I feel silly sometimes. Everyone moves on. She stopped herself. The waiter came in, sensing the interruption. They ordered the first appetizing thing each saw on the menu and leaned back into one another. For Henry, this was always the exciting part, their ability to incite one another. I'm trying to follow. My biggest fear, if you must know, and of course I must know, is that I'm wrong. I mean that my premise is all wrong about all of you, that there was never something you were all trying to do politically, that it was all accidental. Guide me a little more, he said. Remember that bookstore you used to take me to? The one on, was it 89th Street? The New Yorker, yes, 89th Street. Oh, God, don't start me on the New Yorker. I need another glass of wine. Pete Martin, the insane, wonderful man who ran it. Tell me if I'm wrong. They had a communist section. They did. Pete Martin was apparently the illegitimate son of an Italian anarchist. And people still gravitated toward that. Lenin and Marx and Thorstein Veblen and Antonio Gramsci and, oh, who remembers? God, you're bringing it all back. What drives me crazy is this sense that in my lifetime, and certainly in yours, there was still this possibility that we were going to take communism seriously. She laughed a little after she spoke, but he sensed something else, some attempt to crack him open. I mean, I know communism, but still, that some option was still there, still alive. Every play in those days was a socialist tract, every play. The Sunshine Boys was a socialist tract in disguise. Don't joke. I have to. Otherwise, it will break my heart. We were all socialists. You are not wrong about that. We were all heading toward the barricades with no actual idea where the barricades actually were. Socialists, until we weren't anymore. Henry had gestured for and received his third glass of wine. I keep thinking about those movies I've seen. Some of them you took me to when I was way too young. Those foreign movies. I mean, what were you thinking? Maybe that you needed to see those revival houses before they all disappeared, before Netflix took over the world. You took me to see La Guerre est finie when I was like 9 years old. And that other one, that wonderful one set in Budapest after the uprising, Time Stands Still. Yes, in those movies there were all these people sitting around their kitchens, smoking cigarettes and drinking kvass or whatever, knowing they were living after a failed revolution, being able to mourn it. I feel I'm in a city that's living after a failed revolution that it doesn't even know happened. He knew this part of her, knew something of what had taken her over in the last years of her once promising career. If her uncoupledness was a fear, this was a perhaps even greater one, that she would end as one of those women you still saw haunting the Upper West Side, having held on to rent control apartments, women with long, unsculpted gray hair, insufficiently tended teeth, a vacant look, a seer's look. Stop and ask them for directions and they would talk too long. People fell off the rails because it became difficult at a certain point to know precisely where the rails were. Miranda, you've got to have another glass of wine. No more for me. You've got to tell me if I'm crazy. Of course you're not crazy. It was exactly what he'd been thinking or fearing anyway. She was his beautiful, vulnerable daughter, and she had to be consoled. There was, you probably don't remember, a communist meeting hall on our corner. Of course I remember. Right below Anna's building. Yes. I remember the men coming out of it on Friday nights when you and I were bringing home pizza from the V&T. Those men with gray ponytails and those eyes. Yes. She went there. She was one of them. Not a totally committed one, because it would have meant allowing someone else to control what she could paint. Still, a communist. Here we are, extolling them. Shame on us. She simply looked at him, wishing for some encouragement he held back from offering. After Stalin, after all we know, we're not extolling them. It's just amazing to me that even 30 years ago, that still went on, that we hadn't yet given up. Miranda, what are we talking about? In her eyes was the sadness of having gone in a certain desired direction with someone who suddenly demonstrated an unwillingness to go on. She was alone, being asked to cross Riverside on her own while cars rushed past. She was 41 and needed to face how pathetic it was to have such a feeling at this age. Still, a part of her insisted that he could still be her guide, as he'd once been, on the afternoons when he'd picked her up at her grammar school in the West 90s, standing at a distance from the overeager mothers, the cloddish ex-hippie fathers, her father in a snap-brim cap and a raincoat, looking like a spy, his tiny wave to her and his wink, his declaration of their separateness from these others. Didn't you all feel an obligation? You knew what didn't work. Where was capitalism going to lead us? Into more wars? Into these gaps between the incredibly rich and the incredibly poor? I know I'm being reductive. I'm not an intellectual. I'm in over my head. But do you know what I'm saying? It's almost as if you can only ask these basic questions if you don't pretend to be an intellectual. I feel like you all saw the horror of where we would go if we didn't fundamentally stop it, but you decided to go there anyway. They shared a quiet moment. He tried to gather whatever thoughts were available. Very few were. Could he possibly ask for a fourth glass of wine? She was waiting for something from him, a resumption of something, an old dialogue he was now being reminded had been of great importance to her. It felt like a figment of the past he was being called back to, a place he had left and was being chided now for having left. I'm sorry. I think writing about her or just thinking about her, reading her diaries, starting to make me a little crazy, and I'm being a bore. You're the farthest thing from crazy, Miranda, or a bore. Again, she waited for more from him. You think I betrayed something? He asked finally. They were interrupted by the arrival of the food, which he hoped would divert them. You, your generation, she said, undiverted. You saw that you saw that you needed money. You went along. You wrote for television. Ah, yes, the old argument. It had been a mistake to let her know at the time that he considered writing for that particular trashy show, essentially whoring himself out. The harder thing to convince her of had been the feeling that it was time, high time, to stop living marginally. There had been a guilt involved in watching Lily trudge up the steps of their walk-up after a grocery run, laden down with bags. A guilt in his awareness of the streets themselves, never allowing Miranda to be out on her own without extreme worry. What kind of father allowed his family to exist in such circumstances? TV had seemed like salvation at the time, a way to get them out of the city. Crucify me, Miranda. I'm not trying to crucify you, only to understand. I mean, I know New York was partly a hellhole in the 70s, but why wasn't it enough for everyone to just stop for a moment, to halt the rush of things, to just work together to try and figure out what the next thing, the solution, was going to be? I think the answer is Ronald Reagan. Don't be glib. All right, but the answer is still Ronald Reagan. A big, cheery cowboy coming along and essentially saying, hey guys, we don't have to be depressed anymore. Just loosen the financial floodgates, open it all up to foreign investment, and declare the 70s over. And suddenly, everybody's rich and happy and forgetting there was ever a depressive moment in American history. You can't possibly understand what the 70s were like unless you lived through them. A decade where a night out consisted of Network, or The Deer Hunter, or God help us, Apocalypse Now. A night out. These were popular entertainments, Miranda. Movies where you left feeling you had to go storm the fucking Bastille. Then the 80s arrive, and without any real agreement on our part, we find ourselves watching Kramer versus Kramer and Ordinary People. And suddenly it seems like the problem is not a derailed country, but us. Tend to your emotions, be a good parent, and all will be well. I can't believe the movies were enough to halt the progress of an entire generation. Yes, well, think again, Miranda. It doesn't take much to turn a whole culture around. The simple fact is we're not that smart, and most of us, have zero capacity to remember the past. And really, it has to be asked, were we on the verge of a true reassessment, or did all the grunge just make us feel that we were? They looked at each other a moment, and both understood what was there. Every parent-child relationship is like a sea containing an iceberg. The goal is to avoid its vast underground shelf. But that was really the point, Henry thought. It is all underground. There is no avoiding it. Still, the ship, even knowing the pointlessness of it, instinctively wanted to veer away. Tell me now, he said. Was he dodging another question? Why this is so important to you? She regarded him with what he read as disappointment. I guess because I've got to understand her. It came as a relief, the subject moving away from his failings. Anna painted her older son in the 80s. He'd become a lawyer, a corporate lawyer. She was very cruel to him. She hated what she thought he was becoming. So she painted him, hard to really describe, but almost like this decaying being. Her own son. She saw the dangers, I guess, of the corporation. Oh, Miranda, now you sound like you've spent too much time in the communist section of Pete Martin's bookstore. She held back from anything further, saw that she wasn't being invited to continue. Her father was drunk. There had been a volume of such moments in her life, moments where they came to the edge of a desired intimacy before she noted something in his eyes, a retreat, a wish to be pushed so far and no farther. I have this much to give, he seemed to be saying. Understand and respect, please, my limits. It seemed silly at 41 to still be looking for him to push past those limits. And he was right, of course. She saw the dangers of the corporation. Really? Had she become a woman capable of making such a statement? "I'm sorry," he said finally, when the bill had arrived. "I think you've probably learned by now that after 3 glasses of wine, I'm incapable of sequential thought. Now I've got to go up to the apartment and rewrite a scene, God help me." "It's all right. I think what you're basically telling me is that I've got to watch myself, not get lost in this." "No, I'm actually telling you the opposite. If you don't get lost in it, you're not doing it properly." He seemed sincere. She looked into his face to see if it was possible to resume what they'd started earlier. "Get lost, but, well, the trick is to learn how to surface for air." Henry paid the bill, and she walked him to the entrance of his building. At the entrance, he asked if she wanted to come up. "No, you've got a scene to write, don't you?" "That's what I was hoping you'd help me avoid. Go up and do it. Make yourself some coffee." Something in his eyes looked exhausted. He stretched out one hand to circle her face, then reached into his pocket, removed his wallet, and handed her a wad of bills. "I don't like thinking of you on the subway. Take a cab, please. Now you're treating me like a 10-year-old. You'll always be a 10-year-old to me. Don't you see that?" "Dad, no, please. It's too late to be keeping me from the subway. I live here, remember?" He slipped the money into her coat pocket. "Take it. It will help it rewrite my scene to not be worried about you." He hesitated under the awning, unwilling to release her. A handsome young Latino doorman hovered near the entrance. He and Henry obviously knew each other, had a joking relationship. "My daughter, George." "I see," the young man said. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" "Dad, please." "You should date her." This was the place it had so often landed with the two of them, his expansiveness leading to this embarrassing place. "I'm going now. George, you know she dates these young men, these musicians, and here you are with an actual work ethic." George was laughing, but also looking at Miranda in a supportive way, more sensitive to her than her father was being. "Okay, good night." He followed her a little way down the block. "Miranda, forgive me." "You do this. You always do this." "Yes, I know. See it as what?" "I don't know what the fuck it is." Now she avoided his touch. Fatherhood, drunkenness. Not every father seems to want so badly to embarrass his daughter. "It's just George. George, who happens to be a human being. Did you ever consider that you might be embarrassing him as much as you are me? Do you actually think that everyone is exactly like you? That you can say it's just George and dismiss him that way?" He was chastened. In matters such as this, she had become his social conscience and was not shy of asserting her authority. "How many times do I have to say I'm sorry?" She turned away from him, from a face that was now genuinely asking for forgiveness. "I'll let you go, Miranda," he said, seeming a little defeated. "Go and apologize to George." "I will." She waited. "You first," he said. He watched her go, feeling once again that he had blown it, or avoided something, or that very simply, in any father-daughter relationship, there would be pain. There had to be pain. It was at the heart of things, in the DNA of fathering a girl. Miranda turned, walked toward the urgent digital lights of Broadway proper. She did not turn around, but knew he would wait until she was out of sight before returning to his apartment. The onslaught she was subjected to as soon as she turned onto Broadway had the effect of making her lower her head as against a wind, as indeed it was, a wind. Everything possible coming at her at once. The world for sale. The M&M store, Beyonce, Jennifer Lopez, a number of women's faces she didn't recognize, young women in tight jeans and digital movement up on the giant billboards, wet parted lips. The digitalized men who wore their crotches like bow ties, like crowns. The Brooks Brothers world where everyone was white, or might as well be. When actual blackness appeared in these digital ads, it was an impenetrable form, a style choice of affected negation. You can't touch my blackness, but you can buy some aspect of it at H&M and take it home to the Midwest. It had come to this horror, but you couldn't think about the history that had brought it about because you'd wind up saying something like, She saw the dangers of the corporation. Here it was, all around her. But to make such a statement, a perfectly reasonable one, she now thought, put you in the company of those men with gray ponytails and large sunken eyes coming out of the communist meeting hall on 107th and West End. Instead, you were expected to laugh, see what's become of it all, sigh and move on, and take what you can. There was so much to take, after all, if you had the money. She walked toward 42nd Street, trying hard to find some kind of acceptance in herself. She was already close to the subway when she remembered the wad of cash in her pocket. She touched the money, felt it suddenly in this context, like ash in her pocket, like something burned and still intact, something that only a human touch could force to disintegrate. She was going too far, and she knew it. She was slipping and had to hold on. She rounded the corner of 42nd Street, found a panhandler, a woman with cracked lips the color of roof slate, and handed it to her. Then she stepped down into the subway and in her own mind disappeared. Thank you. And thank you for staying with me, because I know that ran a bit long. I appreciate that. Now comes the awkward part, the Q&A. And I know that, you all want to ask questions, but nobody wants to be the first. And I have where are you going, Ellen? No, go ahead. I'm just embarrassing you. So there's a thing I do to let you sort of gear up toward asking a question. I want to just take a couple of minutes to thank some people who have been so helpful on this novel. And I want to start with this guy over here. When you first finish a novel, a draft of a novel, you select a group of people who you think are going to be honest and good readers. And, Michael is paramount among them. But I had also given the first draft of the novel to a group of women who I really respected and wanted to hear from. And I was told in no uncertain terms that I had gone way too far with Henry's character. I mean, when you read the novel, you'll probably see a little bit of what I mean. I was writing under the planet Philip Roth, thinking maybe that it was still the 90s and I could get away with stuff. So all of these women made me feel like I had to abandon the novel. I'd just gone too far. Michael, to his, great credit, said, no, you have to pull it back, but do this novel. This is one you have to do. And I'll never forget that. Your honesty, you're unafraid to hit me when it's necessary. Hit me is exaggerated. I so appreciate that. Where's Josh Miller? So Josh, I had to give this novel to Josh because some of it is set in Haiti. And I have visited Haiti with some of the people who are here tonight. Thank you for coming. We had a wonderful time. How can you say we had a wonderful time in Haiti? We went to Haiti after the earthquake, and we did nothing but laugh. This does not say good things about us. But I had to give it to Josh because I can say the wrong thing. I can say the insensitive thing. And I had to count on Josh to pull me back and say, no, you don't say that. This is, so I so appreciate your read and that. There's one thing you did miss, though. And I didn't find out until I was working with this young, hip copy editor at Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. And I had described, the snugglies that you carry babies in as a papoose. And this young woman said to me, we don't use that word anymore. News to me. Where is Hosey Baskin? There he is. So I had to learn something about the world of auction houses, art auction houses, and Hosey was so generous and giving me help with that and directing me to where I had to look. And finally, Michael's a great reader, Josh is a great reader, but this is the best reader in the world. this woman right here, my wife Eileen. And I'm not saying that just to make you like me, but because you see things that nobody else sees, and you're willing to point out things that nobody else has pointed out. To quote Herman Melville, "You have been my Harvard and my Yale. You have taught me so much." So thank you. I just want to thank you. Yeah, give her applause. Give her applause. Okay, who's ready with a question?
Please raise your hand and I will bring you the
Please
microphone.
raise your hand and the mic will come around. And if you don't ask one, I'm going to pick on you.
Be brave, friends.
Did you let your daughter read the book before it came out?
You know, that's a complicated question. No. No. And she's watching tonight, so I'm very nervous. But it's such an odd thing because when you write, I assume this is true of everybody, maybe not, maybe it's just me, you give yourself this enormous freedom. You take characters who are like you and somebody else you might be writing about, but not you. You know, you've made the adjustment in your head. These people are not me, and everybody's going to understand this, and it's not always the case. So I think she's very nervous about reading this book, and I want her to take her time and read it only when she wants. And I want her to read it because I really want to have a conversation with her about some of the things that come up between Henry and Miranda. Yeah? Sir. Yes, you, Larry Hott. Oh.
It's a combination of two questions. Do you think you could have written this when you were younger? Did you have to be older to write it? And do you think you were thinking differently because of the way politics have changed in the last 10, 12 years?
Okay. So there's a book group that meets in Northampton, and Marty is in it, and Bob Bissell. Where's Bob Bissell? And I would always meet with this group after I had written a novel, and the late Alan Dano was always kind of tough with me. And one of the questions he would ask is, why are you always writing about sons? Why aren't you writing about fathers? And I appreciated that question because I think it's kind of where I located myself for too long, in the position of the son. To write as a father, and to write honestly as a father, and to write, I think, bravely as a father, I think you have to, I'm sure you are all much more mature than I am, emotionally mature than I am, but I had to get to a certain point where I was ready to do that. It's really only in the last two novels that I have. So your second question is about whether politics have changed in the last 12 years. It goes further back for me because, to me, I think one of the reasons I'm thinking so much about the 70s and what it felt like to live in the 70s is I really do remember that what Henry calls that depressive moment of the mid-70s. I remember being in New York, and I had jobs. I actually had jobs in business because I was a young actor, and I was trying to, I had to make money. And I remember looking around to these business guys and thinking, don't you guys realize you're becoming obsolete? Don't you realize that something is happening that is going to make this whole world disappear? I really felt that. And the fact that what was there in the 70s, I mean, Jimmy Carter did not succeed in convincing us of what he wanted to convince us of, which was we needed to stop and examine. I mean, you look back and you think how hard it was to get over Vietnam. That, again, to repeat the phrase, that depressive moment where we didn't know where we were going. And it's so interesting, Gene Hackman died last week. Gene Hackman was the perfect actor for the 70s because he always looked depressed. He always looked harried. He always looked weighted down. That was the 70s, and that's where we were supposed to be. But again, Reagan came along, and as I brilliantly say here, you know, ordinary people and Kramer, we're just supposed to be good parents. So it goes back to that for me, not just the last 12 years. Yeah, sorry, I can go on. Ms. Weiss.
I was wondering if in the writing of this, if there were moments where you got stuck and how you navigated your way out of the stuckness, if you did have moments where you got stuck.
I don't get stuck. I do scenes that are wrong, but that doesn't mean I didn't have a good time writing them. You know, it's like that, the classic thing about always knowing at the end of one day the sentence you're going to write at the beginning of the next day that just keeps you going. And that always works for me. But as I said earlier, it's when the novel is done and you show it to people, and then you have to pull back, in my case, that makes it hard. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question about the pulling back that you then had to do after Michael read the novel, and what process you had to go through internally, really, to do that, what that was like.
So I had let Henry go in a kind of Philip Roth way. The novel I was thinking about when I was writing this novel was Sabbath's Theater. I don't know if you all know Sabbath's Theater. I mean, it is the novel in which Philip Roth, just no holding back. And I thought, yeah, you can do that. You can do that. And, you know, I begin this novel in 2018. I'm showing it to people for the first time in 2021. The world had changed in those 3 years. Not just COVID, the Me Too movement. You know, it's just a sense of what women were not willing to take in a male character. Why should I read that, you know? So how do you do it? The question was, how do you do what you want to do, which is presenting a character facing a real, I won't tell you what happens to Henry and what happens in the novel, but he faces a real moral quandary. And I just had to think through that and test it and test it and test it. And again, give it to readers. And Irene, again, was really helpful then, because she's the one who said in one book, I hate this guy. So I knew I had to get to the point where she didn't hate him anymore. She tolerated him. I could just go that far. So I do want to allow for some book signing. If there's one more, I'd be happy to answer it, but then we can sell some books. We good? All right. Thank you so much for coming. The hometown crowd, you can't beat them. So I'll be out there signing books with new pens that I bought. How you doing, man?